Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erica Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erica Mayall, and this is part 4 of our competition countdown series. And today we are going to be talking all about fueling for competitions. And I am super excited for this one because I have a guest joining me today. So I am joined by Jenny Accettura, who is from Center Stage Nutrition. Jenny's love for nutrition was sparked after 17 years as a competitive dancer and learning how to sustain the unmatched physical demands of dance. When she was dancing, Jenny struggled to know how to properly fuel for performance, and like many dancers, worried about losing her dancer body once she retired. This experience inspired her to become a dietitian and help fellow dancers to navigate this journey. As a registered dietitian with both clinical and private practice experience, she has had the opportunity to work with a diverse client population to help them develop personalized and sustainable nutrition plans. More than your average dietitian, she also worked in quality improvement and patient safety, which has provided her with a unique insight into the frameworks that she builds for clients to ensure that plans are both sustainable and results-driven. So welcome to the podcast today, Jenny. I'm so excited you're here, and I can't wait to dive into talking all about fueling for competitions.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Super excited to dive into it all. Very timely to just talk about all this stuff competition-wise.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into that, I would just love to hear a tiny bit about your journey in the dance world, kind of like how it started. I know in your bio you were a competitive dancer, but if you could just like tell us a little bit of your background so the listeners can get to know you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. When I saw that, I was like, oh, wow, I'm going back far now. So I started off in Highland dancing and Scottish dancing when I was really little. And I loved it. And when we switched studios, I got really into ballet. So that kind of switched to be like my major focus when I was around like 10 or so. I did a variety of dancing at that time. So I did ballet, jazz, contemporary. But that was my like true passion. And I loved it. I loved my teacher. And Point was my favorite. So I danced competitively for a while. I went to Royal Winnipeg Ballet for one of the summer intensive programs there. And that was my true passion for a while. And danced up until I was like 20. So,
amazing.
Yeah, that was, I loved it. And I was always kind of wondering about the food piece. That's kind of how I made the connection into nutrition, which I'm sure we'll chat about. But a whole bunch of things popped up in my teens about that. So I was always very curious and intrigued by the nutrition part too, but didn't know anything about it.
Yeah, as most dancers, I think, and especially like in our generation, like people growing up, like it wasn't really something that we knew anything about. It really wasn't talked about in any positive ways, at least, or like sort of constructive, helpful ways. So I think you're not alone. And like with other guests who've been on the podcast, like often our own sort of like curiosities within our dance journey. So in my case, it was more about like the anatomy and the biomechanics. And like that was where I was like, oh, this is the part I want to learn more about. And obviously in your case, it was more like the nutrition part of it. So was there sort of like a moment where you're like, this is exactly what I want to do. Like I want to go and like study dietetics and stuff like that. Or was it sort of more just like a gradual starting to learn about things and then it kind of continuing down that path?
A little bit of both. One of my friends did have an eating disorder when I was in my teens. And I just got like really interested in that and wanted to like learn more about it and how to like support somebody through that. So that was always one of my main interests. And I remember though, like I didn't really know how to go about it. I think you're so young, right? Like you don't know like where you're going at like 18. And I remember talking to my mom about like what I wanted to do in school. And she's like, well, you love food. and you love the like physical aspect of dance. So maybe that could be something. I remember us talking about it. And then I did go into it for that. It just took me a little while to come back to actually working in private practice as a dietitian. I worked at a hospital for a little bit with a different population. But I remember I was like reaching out to nutrition experts in like the dance field when I was like there. And I remember like looking back, and I had all these notes from like when I was starting there as to how they got into private practice and how they started working with dancers. So it was always in the back of my head. And then I finally got the courage to take the jump, because that was always something I was passionate about. And so happy that I did, because I love that the work that I do with dancers. But yeah, it was kind of like always something I had in the back of my mind, and kind of gradually got into it. And then, yeah, so again, so happy that I did, because it's obviously great to do something that you love and relate to people and work in an area where, yeah, you were once in their, where they are at, and how to like support and improve nutrition. Cause it's like a often forgotten in the dance world, as I'm sure you know too. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for dancers, it's so important to have somebody that they can relate to. And whether that is like through nutrition or through physio or through anything, that it makes such a difference when there's somebody like, people always come in the clinic and they're like, oh my God, you speak the same language as me, like in terms of understanding about like the ins and outs of the dance world and like what that entails. So, I'll talk about marking something if they're like injured and needing to modify, and they're like, oh, you know what marking is? Whereas like another physio wouldn't use that terminology. And I'm sure it's exactly the same for you with like nutrition, where you can 100% relate to, the structure and schedules of studios and things like that. So it's like when you're actually trying to develop plans and like figure out like when dancers have time to have snacks and eat and things like that, you're like, okay, I get this. I know that you can't just like eat every 2 hours necessarily, because that's just not the reality in a dance setting all of the time. So I think it makes such a difference for dancers to have access to people who understand the environment and sort of what their experiences are. Just before we get specifically into competition stuff, do you want to tell us just a tiny bit about like the populations that you work with? I know like in private practice, obviously we've been alluding to the fact that you work with dancers, but sort of like who you most commonly work with, or what, your clientele often involves.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, that part would be very important. So yeah, I do work with quite a range. So I work with I'm working with a lot with the younger dancers in competition right now. So I often get requests for that. And just, I think the major thing that I see in like the discovery calls is I want to make sure we're fueling enough. And I want some strategies for competition or long dance days, whether it's like funny area between school and dance, late night eating, or not enough time during actual dance day, which we're not given breaks, as we know, to actually have something. So that's a big area that I'm focusing on right now. But I do actually see quite a bit of range. So I have a couple clients that are in that category, and then like aspiring dancers who are in like dance schools. So in BC, I see some dancers from Arts Umbrella. I'm happy to do some workshops and one-on-one work with them there. So like the 18 to 21 category. And then I actually do have some like retired dancers. So I can really relate from that side of it as well, where maybe people are rebuilding their relationship with food and body after years of disordered eating, or just having a change in their schedule and activity level and not really knowing how to fuel anymore. So I see dancers across like that whole continuum. But right now there's a lot of competitive dancers I'm working with. And yeah, just the kind of when you're finished with dance or retired, and how do you really move on with your food and activity level after that, while making dance maybe another part of it. So yeah, it's really a range, but I'm happy to work with kind of aspiring competitive and then professional dancers too.
Amazing. So getting into specifically like kind of fueling for competition. And I know like we're going to frame this with competition just because that's the little series that's happening right now. But I know that this information for anybody listening out there, you could absolutely be sort of listening around the edges and applying this to, even if it's just like show weeks or things like that. If you are not a competitive dancer, but you have like more performance-based schedules. And so this information, although we're going to talk about it in the lens of competition, certainly applies to lots of other like dance kind of times or other performance opportunities and things like that. So to start off with, what would be the recommendations in terms of strategies or things that dancers can do before a competition starts? So either the days leading up to a competition or even like the evening before a competition. I know in a lot of like the athletic world, we always hear about, say, runners or things like that, like carbo loading the night before a marathon or things like that. But for dancers, what is recommended in terms of fueling yourself leading up to a competition?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question to start off with. I think that oftentimes I tell people, like, just like you're rehearsing your performance, you want to rehearse your nutrition in advance. You want to know what works. I find this is where people fall a little bit short. So we think that, okay, competition's coming up, I need to do something completely different, when in fact, we should be working on our nutrition leading up to it, like weeks leading up to it, months leading up to it. So we know what snacks and meals work for us, and we can have a bit of a plan in place. So that's kind of the first thing I usually suggest. It's something we got to think about way in advance and actually determine what works for us. There's going to be a lot of trial and error. I have specific suggestions, but there's going to be a lot of trial and error to determine what really works for you and your body. Make sure that you have the most energy possible for that day, because nerves kick in, so many other feelings kick in on the day. You don't want to have to be thinking about nutrition and thinking about new strategies. So that's, I would say, number one. Number two, when we're thinking about like actual nutrition advice for the meal, let's say you're like the night before. So there is some specific stuff to look at there. So you want to think about well, kind of like I said, something that you're familiar with. So it's not something super new that's going to cause a surprise like stomach upset, for instance. You want to think of something that has that balance of, like, let's say carb, protein, and fat, but nothing like too heavy where you feel like you're going to feel like super weighed down. So like, I'm just going to give an example of, like, let's say you have like a pasta bake dish or like fajitas or like a wrap with salad and chocolate milk, something, those kind of like meals the night before can be really helpful. And you want to make sure you're fueled adequately. So let's say you've got dinner and then maybe a bedtime snack would be helpful, because sometimes competition mornings can be early. We might not feel like eating super early. So you want to make sure you're really well fueled that night of, especially. So you're topping up your glycogen stores. So that's kind of the storage form of energy that we're going to use the next day. So that dinner and then like a carb and protein based snack before bed can really top it up for us, so that we're ready to go the next day. So yeah, that's what I would focus on the night before. But the days leading up, definitely practice a lot of your meals and snacks. If you're a parent and a younger dancer, or even an older dancer, you maybe want to write out some snacks and meals that you know you're going to pack with you. Because it's such a different change in environment as well, and you really want to plan for that in advance. So you don't really actually need to do any like special carb loading to answer that question too specifically.
Awesome. I think that's super helpful. And that actually just like kind of like sparked something, just like another little question that I think is something that's a good point to bring up in terms of, like you were saying, sort of practicing foods and things you're familiar with, so you know that you like can tolerate them well. Because a lot of times dance competitions involve traveling. And so if you are having to like eat out in restaurants and hotels and things like that, I think that's a really valid point, that it's like, even if something on a menu looks like super exciting, maybe like the night before the competition is not the time to try that. If it's like something that you're not totally sure how your body's going to react to, maybe you pick something that you are very familiar with, like you eat regularly at home. So even if it's not like a, kind of home cooked meal, so it's not the exact same thing, at least it's something your body is familiar with. So I think that's such a good point that maybe I wouldn't have necessarily thought of before in terms of like foods that your body's familiar with.
Yeah, 100%. And I think you can do that stuff after. I always encourage people like celebrate, go for team dinners, etc. Like do a lot of that, I think, after. So yeah, I think that that's a really key point there too, to still enjoy it. But yeah, the more familiar foods right before, so you won't have to think about it as much. And that's often something we'll brainstorm in some workshops I've done recently, is like, okay, you're at like Starbucks, or you see this in the grocery store, you start with this. How can you add to things to it to make sure it's a bit more complete, or an optimized like fueling meal or snack? So you can work with like being out and able to choose things too.
Yeah, that's awesome. And really just like that, practicing that, like you said, so that it's not like, all of a sudden end up in the grocery store and you're like, oh, I don't know what to pick. And then it becomes like an overwhelming thing. It's like actually practice that. And especially things like Starbucks where, chances are wherever you're competing, there's probably a Starbucks close by. So at least their menus are consistent. And so you kind of know like what your options might be even when you are out and about. So that's super helpful. And then what about competition day? I know these are like the crazy day schedules can be like really intense. I mean, it depends a bit on the competition, whether it's a longer duration one and you're competing multiple days in a row, but then maybe on those days it's only like 1 or 2 dances a day versus a more compact one where maybe some dancers will like sometimes even have, 7 or 8 dances like in one day of a competition. So what are the most helpful strategies for fueling on actual competition day?
Yeah. So I think that let's start off with as much as we can get in for breakfast as possible. I know this is a really tough one for a variety of reasons. We may not feel like it. We may have nerves. We may be rushing out the door. But it's really a good time to set us up for success. It actually may be a little bit more time than the rest of the day. So we want to take advantage of that fueling opportunity and try to get something in and as much as we can. If nerves do really hit hard, then having liquids instead of solids may be better. So juices or smoothies and really working your way up. But I think it's really important to start with something there. I always think if you're on the go and trying to grab something, and it always depends what type of dancer you are too. Do you like to have something at home before you leave, or are you going to grab something on the go? Both can work. And I think that's what is important for people to know too. You can always adapt it based on what you prefer and what you like to do. For example, if you're on the go and a bagel egg sandwich is perfect. If you could stomach something like that, or let's say if you're going by and getting a smoothie or something like that, and having something else on the side, that is actually totally fine to start your day with. I think that's an important piece to start off with. And then I think when it comes to fueling throughout the day, everyone's schedules I think are so hectic. It's important to pack shelf stable snacks as much as you can. So as much as we'd love to make things and have them ready to go, they can be really helpful. Let's say I'm in the midst of packing daycare lunches right now, by the way. So my mind is thinking protein packed muffins and patties, anything that she'll eat that will have some protein in it. Yeah. So that stuff can be helpful if you've got a cooler and things like that. But you do want to take advantage of some shelf stable things that I know sometimes people have a tough time wrapping their heads around. But that can be something that's obviously going to last, really easy to grab, and often can be a quick energy source. So some things let's say, packaged snacks, you can do protein bars, you can do jerky, you can do dried fruit, applesauce, have a lot of those things ready to go, because you really want that quick energy source and something that's going to be easy to grab. I find one of the main mistakes I see people making is going because I often hear, I want to feel light. I don't want to feel weighed down from food, which I totally understand because I hated that feeling as a dancer, and didn't really understand what would make me feel that way. But if we're going to go super light, veggies, and I see a lot of people snacking on salads or veggies and dip or something, that can be okay, but you're going to miss out on a major fueling source, which is carbs there. And it's not going to fuel you throughout your day, especially if you have very little time to eat. So kind of prioritizing those shelf stable snacks can be really helpful. I tell people the closer they are to performance, the more you want to prioritize a very quick acting carbohydrate. And then kind of as the further out you are from dance, you're going to want to have maybe more of a legit meal, a couple hours, 1 to 2 hours, maybe a protein carb snack. And then the really close you get, you want to prioritize a lot of those carb type things, the applesauce, the dried fruit, things like that. So you're kind of lessening the type of foods that you're including. But it's got to be really quick and then often very efficient. So veggies and salads aren't going to be efficient for energy. You want to go carb-based, which is just hard to get our brains around, I think, after hearing sugar messages for so long. But athletes' nutrition, just like dancers' nutrition, is very specific in that. And that's just one of the strategies to use. But I think, breakfast, a lot of those snacks to have on hand, using that guideline, the closer you are to your performance. Keeping hydrated is obviously going to be very important as well. So sometimes like you don't really have access to a lot of things at the actual like performance center or competition center, maybe a fountain being one of them. So making sure that you have thought about that in advance and what you're bringing for hydration. So yeah, those are a couple things that come to mind. I've got some parents and dancers that I'm working with right now that are like combining their thoughts and efforts together to pack things for like a fueling station.
Cool.
Setting that up. So that can be really helpful too, not just having one person and doing it for their own dancer, but like working together in that too.
Yeah, and you see that in kids' sports tournaments. I know it'll be like, parents are responsible for bringing certain things for, like snack tables and fueling stations and stuff like that. The other thing that I've seen, I don't know if you've seen it, it's like, and by I say I've seen, it's like a TikTok trend basically, is those like snackle boxes. And so those like plastic tackle boxes, and then each compartment has like something different in it. So like dried fruit in one and goldfish crackers in one or whatever. And I think the kids, especially younger dancers, like really like that kind of like snackle box type situation. And, there's lots of TikTok trends that you kind of roll your eyes at. But that one, I was like, oh, those seem great for like kind of backstage or that type of thing to have, like you said, those shelf stable snacks and like a variety of things. Because sometimes I know I found when I was a dancer, it's like I would pack something. And then when it came time, I'd be like, oh, I really don't want to eat that right now. I really want, I don't know, something else. So to have like kind of a variety of things to choose from, like maybe you actually wanted something like more liquidy, like an applesauce versus, and you had packed, I don't know, a protein bar or whatever it was. So I actually kind of love the snackle box trend right now.
Yeah, that's actually really good. Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I did see it the other day, and I think that's super smart. And especially like if people take turns doing it, it doesn't feel like as much, and it's kind of exciting to have like a bit of like a team fueling station. So I think that's a great idea. Another studio I was working with they were actually ordering in food for like the dancers. So they that could be an idea if you've really got nothing around.
Yeah, I know that's totally different than when we were competing. Like people literally can like Uber Eats food to a theater, whereas like if you were in a bit of a food desert, like in terms of your location, like we didn't have a lot of options often. One of the theaters that we performed at often, the only thing near it was a gas station that was right across the street. There's only so many snack options at a gas station. But like now, I think a lot of dancers are utilizing ordering food into a theater, which I think can be great.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's another great kind of strategy to do as well. So yeah, a lot of things to think about, but I think the planning and you really got to think about it in advance, which I know can be a lot, but they will set you up for success and less stress around it on the day of.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talked a little bit about like, obviously the closer you get to performance, the more we want to prioritize those like kind of like fast acting carbohydrates. So then if we're thinking more about kind of recovery or fueling like between competition days or even just like at the end of a competition, so really kind of focusing on like that recovery aspect of things, I imagine then the recommendations change a little bit in terms of what we want that like balance of stuff to look like. So can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah. The first thing I want to tackle with there too, if it is late, it's still super important to fuel up and to have something.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I hear that very often as well. I think a lot of parents and dancers worried about it being too late to eat. But especially if you've got back-to-back days, that's going to be the major thing. It actually does help with like sleep as well. If you do have something kind of closer to bed, which is a bit of a myth, that it does the opposite. So actually can help with sleep. You're going to recover faster. You're like replenishing the tank before the next day. So a lot of benefits, even if it is late at night. But yes, that whole like meal and snack makeup there, it can be helpful to have both, by the way, if you've got time. But if we're looking at a meal, then yeah, we want to prioritize. Still, carbohydrates is always like a pretty big part of meals and snacks for dancers, but you want a sufficient amount of protein there as well, because that's going to help build and repair your muscles after a very long day. Having some like antioxidants there can actually help with the recovery process too. So when I say antioxidants, I mean things like you could do like berries or dark greens. That is supposed to help with the recovery process a bit more and reduce inflammation. So that's kind of like, I would say like the basics there, adding some fats there as well. So you want a bit more of like a robust, like balanced meal. I think it's always great to connect with your team too, if you can, and maybe have that as like a bit of a celebratory meal. Some additional add-ons in that recovery process. So we talked about antioxidants. Omega-3 can be really helpful too. So we see that in like fatty fish like salmon. You do chia seeds as well in some sort of meal. And then, that can kind of like be some additional add-ons that can help with the recovery process as well. But making sure that we have it in the first place, even if it is late. You could do like a meal and a snack before bed if you've got time for sure. That would be, so you're replenishing your stores, because we got to think of the beginning of the end of the end of the day. If we do have like a little bit more time, then you want to take advantage of those fueling opportunities, especially if the day has been complete wild craziness, which, sometimes it can be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always like when I think about some of those days, I think about like conventions almost more so than competitions, where some of those days are actually just like wildly long and not a lot of like opportunities. Whereas at a competition, ideally, or like oftentimes maybe there is like a couple of hours between dances. And so maybe there's more opportunity for like fueling and things like that throughout the day. So, I mean, that's not always the case. We do have lots of dancers who dance a lot of numbers in one day in a competition, but I often think about conventions with some of that craziness. So that's really great advice in terms of like really trying to think about like the front and back end of the day, or like the beginning and end of the day, as like those are opportunities to really I don't know if make up for is the right word, but kind of make sure that at least you're like fueling enough if the middle of the day was a bit chaotic and didn't allow that opportunity in terms of like, fueling and stuff. And then in terms of, and you might have actually said this, but in terms of like hydration, I know you talked about it a little bit just in terms of like staying hydrated during the day, but are there recommendations, especially like thinking more so from a recovery standpoint, in terms of like what that should look like from a hydration standpoint? Because I think that's something that dancers often, although I will say this generation of dancers is probably better again than our generation of dancers was, like everybody kind of carries around their water bottles. But what are the recommendations around that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, no, definitely. I feel like we didn't have as many options for hydration either. I don't know.
True.
Yeah. But it definitely wasn't top of mind also. I mean, for hydration, it's super specific based on the individual, but especially like, like if we're thinking more like kind of more like electrolyte kind of things as well, like other things to add instead of just water, that can be helpful, especially for like over the age of, let's say, like 12, we're getting into our teens. If you're like, sometimes I say if you're a bit of like a salty sweater, and you're sweating a lot during the day, or you're losing quite a bit, sometimes it can be helpful to introduce a bit more of like an electrolyte there. So when I say electrolyte, I mean like something with some sodium in there. There's different ones out there on the market, like Gatorade, Scratch, Tailwind. There's so many, but you want to have one that has actually sufficient amount of like carb and sodium in it. So there are some guidelines around that. But that can be helpful in the recovery process as well. So kind of replenishing your salt stores. It can be in a beverage, or it can be like from sodium, or it can be, you can add it to your foods as well. So you kind of get it back that way. In terms of like the amounts, it really varies. So kind of drinking as much as you can after. Quite individual there, but you always can change up the beverage. So not just water, it can be a hydration beverage. Chocolate milk, some people like having after, because it can be great for recovery. So normalizing that all those things are okay. Other athletes use them, but there's like a huge kind of thing in the dance world that those things are bad, which
absolutely,
for a lot of reasons. So normalizing that too.
Yeah. And especially just like, I'm going to go slightly off topic, but on the topic of electrolytes too, we see such high rates of like hypermobility in the dance world. And oftentimes if hypermobile dancers have other sort of comorbidities like POTS or things like that, it's like even more important for them to be getting sufficient electrolyte as like a symptom management thing. So I realize that's not what we're talking about today necessarily, but like you said, like it's kind of, it is not necessarily as well accepted in the dance world as it is in other sports worlds, but like arguably it's maybe even more important for dancers because we have a higher rate of hypermobility within dancer populations than you might see in other sports populations. So hopefully we're starting to see that shift a little bit as people understand that a bit more. But I think it's been challenging for a long time for people to accept things like that as like necessary within the dance world.
100%. I think half of the like work I do with dancers up front is like kind of working through our nutrition beliefs and how they're different for dancers and athletes, and how we need to kind of change our thinking or our mindset around different foods. So yeah, that's something.
Yeah, and talk loads about that on this podcast of like taking things that we know from sports and like actually applying them to dance, because although obviously it is different and obviously it is an art form and there's different elements to it physically, it's actually not that different. Like dancers are athletes in that sense. And so when we're actually looking at just basic sport science, whether it's sport nutrition or other types of sport science, we really should be utilizing so much more of it within the dance world. And we are slightly behind on the uptake of that. Although again, I see improvements and I do see changes in recent years, but we still could be utilizing so much more of that stuff in terms of looking at, the science out there in the sports world and really applying it more to the dance world. So that is amazing. Thank you so much for that. Like very, very helpful advice. Hopefully that gives, especially parents too, like an idea of what they can be doing to facilitate. Because for our younger dancers, like let's face it, it is the parents that are packing the snacks and doing all of that type of thing. But even for the dancers themselves and understanding kind of where they should be prioritizing things in terms of making sure that they are fueling their body adequately so they can perform at their best on competition days. Before we fully wrap up, I always have 5 kind of like rapid fire questions that I like to ask guests when they've come on the podcast. So if you are up for that, I would love to do those. So what is your favorite genre or style of dance?
Oh boy. So I love like point ballet. That was my thing. I love like watching contemporary though. Like if I were, love like watching it, but I was always like scared to let go and fully do it.
Fair. Yeah. All right. Question number 2. Would you rather be on the stage or in the studio?
I think on the stage. I love that like thrill of it and the like excitement, even though it's like nerve wracking. I loved actually being on stage. It was my favorite part.
Awesome. If you could dance with or share the stage with any dancer, past or present, who would it be and why?
This is a tough one, but the funny thing that came to my mind was, wouldn't it be cool to dance with your dance teacher?
Yes. I feel like you're the first person who's ever said that, but yeah,
really?
That would be so cool.
Okay, yeah. No, I think that would be a really interesting experience. Like a couple dance teachers or like, one of them. Personally, I would love to dance with my ballet teacher. I think that would be a hoot and a half. So yes.
Yeah, amazing. I actually, fun random anecdotal fact, I actually ended up doing one of my tap exams with one of my teachers. Like we went in together as candidates because she was my ballet teacher, but she was like doing her teaching qualifications and needed to take this tap exam. And so the 2 of us got put in, neither of us were tappers at all. And we went into, I think it was our intermediate tap exam together. And we still laugh about it to this day because we were both like, we didn't really have a lot of business being there, but both of us were doing it more for teaching purposes than anything, but we still laugh about it. And so I did actually have sort of that experience of a little bit dancing with one of my teachers, and it was quite amusing.
Yeah, I would definitely be into that.
Awesome. All right, next question. What's one thing you would go back and tell your younger self as a dancer?
It's hard to narrow it down. But I feel like I guess don't worry. I think what I used to do was like worry a lot about like other people's judgment and perspectives about certain styles a dance I was doing. Like I kind of maybe said before, I think when it came to like contemporary and a bit more of a different style, I think I was really confident in one style. And then when I went to something I wasn't as confident in, I think I just, got super nervous and in my head and couldn't really like let go, even though I really liked what I was doing. So I wish I kind of didn't do that as much and embraced like the challenge and not trying to be like too perfect at what I was doing. Even though I loved ballet, I think I got so into like the technique part of it. I think that was just kind of my personality and like the detail, like intricacy of it. That trying something different often got me pretty nervous and out of my comfort zone. So I wish I embraced that a little bit more. Because I got a little paralyzed when I didn't really know what I was doing. So, and I think that's the beauty of it sometimes, and you have to kind of lean into that. And then from a nutrition point, though, I would tell myself not to go for energy drinks right before competition time. Probably not the best thing.
Not the best choice.
Not. Yeah.
All right. Last question. If there was one thing that you could change about the dance world, what would it be?
I think when we were talking about like how dancers are athletes and like it's unfortunate that the world of dance is a bit slow in catching up to other sports there. I think that's one thing, like kind of treating dancers or looking at the dancer environment as a bit more of like an athlete environment, and like having a bit more wraparound support for dancers. There's often not a lot of like health support, I find, especially like in companies, or just like not a lot of awareness around that and where you can go. So I think that's a big piece, having that support, being like obviously more inclusive and accepting of like different body types obviously is going to be a huge thing on my list too, because I see a lot of dancers struggling with that. But I think we're just super behind in how we like support dancers. Like if we're not going to give a dancer break to eat, but yet we're bringing in a dietitian to talk about nutrition, something's wrong with that picture. We've got to like actually give them time to eat, and throughout like an 8-hour day or 4-hour day or 3, like anything really,
anything,
right? Yeah. I see dancers that are dancing like 8 hours a day and have like 2 minutes to eat, or the 3 to 4 hours common with nothing, right? So
all the time.
We've got to change that if we want our dancers to actually dance long and be healthy and injury free. So that's a huge thing on my list.
Totally. I was just chatting with a instructor who teaches like circus, but also teaches like acro within a dance community. And she was telling me, so she teaches at this one circus place, and she has a 2-hour class, and the kids have a 20-minute dinner break in that 2-hour class. And she was just like, what's even like, and so to her, she was just like, that's insane. But the class runs, I think, from like 5 to 7. It runs like right over the dinner hour, basically. So in the circus environment, they've like built that in. And she was just like, well, both of us were just like, that would never happen in the dance world. Like, regardless of what time of day it was, like if somebody only had a 2-hour class, and it's not like the circus kids are there for that 2-hour class and they're there for the whole night, like they're literally there for 2 hours and they have a dinner break. And so we were kind of laughing about it, but also we're like, we really need to be making sure that dancers have breaks, and maybe not necessarily in the middle of a 2-hour class, but when they have multiple hours and multiple classes in a row, making sure that we facilitate their schedules so that they can actually adequately fuel themselves.
100%.
All right. I realize what time it is and don't want to keep you too much longer, but just before we wrap up, how can people reach you? What is the best way to connect with you? I will, of course, put your website in the show notes of the podcast episode, but tell us all the ways that people can connect with you.
Yeah, for sure. So if you want to reach out to me directly, you can email me, jenny@centerstagenutrition.com. I have an Instagram profile as well, Center Stage Nutrition, where you can find a lot of competition fueling tips if you're getting into that. We talked about all things recovery today, and I have a recovery guide off my website that you can download. So that's something that you can always start off with as well. But those are kind of the 2 ways to get in touch with me. You can email me or find me on Instagram, and get started with some tips there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate you taking time to do this. And I know it's going to help the dancers within this community so much and make sure that they are getting the most out of their competition season. So I really appreciate you taking the time, and I appreciate everybody listening today. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.